Hey Erica, thanks so much for talking about tariffs yet again.
Hey, Kyla, sure.
So I first want to ask, we've gotten a lot of news about tariffs, tariffs being enacted, to tariffs potentially being unenacted. And the biggest question I think a lot of people are wrestling with is, what does Trump think he's achieving, and why do these policies leave so many economists confused?
I wish there was a clear answer to the goal of these tariffs. Of course, the tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, the authorities that President Trump is using to impose those are related to a national emergency for fentanyl and illegal border crossings. That's not really the case, especially with Canada. And then when you hear Trump talk about the tariffs, he also mentions bilateral trade deficits quite a bit, and then different industry concerns. So I think there's a variety of kind of motivations going on, and that makes, the durability of the policy unclear. If it really is something that can be negotiated on, then you would lift the tariffs. If it's because we want, new tax revenues and Trump is upset about bilateral trade deficits, then it could mean the tariffs last for longer. I think part of the reaction from economists is first, there isn't a clear strategy, so it makes it really hard to see why tariffs are the tool being used. And then second, given these various concerns, tariffs wouldn't even be the right tool to use. If we're concerned about the trade balance, that's more of a reflection of differences between, domestic saving and domestic investment. And tariffs don't really hit either of those directly. So they're not a tool that's really going to lead to a big change in the trade balance. If it's, negotiations over border or drug policy, other things, that's typically best achieved through other avenues, not taxes that, fall on American consumers. So I think that's where most of this confusion is coming from.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't seem like it's the right policy to fix these problems. And at his address toward Congress on Tuesday, March 4th, he had a big statement about tariffs, and he was like, they make Americans richer. But in order to make everybody richer, it's going to require a little bit of disturbance. And so when you hear that, like when you hear about this disturbance eventually maybe making people better off, what should Americans expect when they hear something like that?
I mean, he's right that there's going to be a disturbance, but he's wrong as to the ultimate outcome of what tariffs do. Tariffs will be a tax increase that fall on Americans. They'll also invite foreign retaliation that has a similar effect for the domestic economies of those countries, but also reduces U.S. exports there. And those effects don't go away. It's not like, there's a magic reversal button after 2 years where things get great. Those negative effects persist. And so it will be short-term pain and also long-term pain, lower output, higher taxes, lower incomes. So there's not really this upside to tariffs.
Yeah, and it seems like the administration knows that to a certain extent, starting to walk back some of the, tariffs that they're placing on automotive manufacturers and giving them a 1 month exemption. And so could you explain that, you had a big news hit, or you didn't have, but a news hit was in Bloomberg talking about how cars are going to go up $12,000 in cost. So what is your reaction to kind of the seemingly recognition that the tariffs are going to be expensive and trying to help people through that?
We saw hints of this in the first Trump administration, too. There were delays ahead of Christmas in case, Trump said, in case this would impact consumer prices for the things you're going to buy for your kids. Well, it would, and he delayed it because of that. And we also saw a similar exemption process where companies could apply product by product. And what, you end up with when you have a tax increase imposed by one person and they have authority over that is that they also get to choose who doesn't pay the tax. And unfortunately, that leads to, a lot of political wheeling and dealing, potential for corruption, potential for, making political donations and then getting an exemption, or just generally politically favored industries getting exemptions like we're seeing with autos right now. That's not to say there would be a lot of economic harm if we imposed taxes, on North American auto trade. We don't want to go down that route. But we also shouldn't be going down the route of exemptions for certain industries while everyone else is left, paying these taxes. But you're exactly right. It shows like the Trump administration does understand these are harmful policies. They would have very negative consequences. And that means we shouldn't be doing them broadly at all. I think that's where it leaves us.
Yeah, with maybe they can be used for negotiation if they're not broad-based, right? Like targeted would probably be a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen presidents throughout history kind of, use tariffs in this limited fashion with the understanding that like even a small tariff still has economic consequences, but maybe there's a negotiating reason or, some type of motivation. Maybe it's even a political motivation. It's a politically favored industry, so you're narrowly trying to target it. It's really unprecedented, just the broad nature of the tariffs we're seeing here and the lack of like clear strategic goal to go along with them.
Yeah, and the response from other countries has been pretty intense, I think. Like China, there was a tweet from one of their foreign representatives where it was like, if you want a trade war, if you want a regular war, like we're willing to go to any type of war. And then Canada, their leader, Justin Trudeau, was like, even if Trump, he has to walk back all of these tariffs, not just any of them, in order for Canada to get rid of their retaliatory tariffs. And so how much further do you think this can escalate as we're harming other countries and clearly harming ourselves just objectively? Like, what do you see in how other countries are responding to this?
Yeah, my hunch the second time around was that countries would be more prepared for like swifter and stronger retaliation because they, dusted off those responses during the first Trump administration. They worked out those muscles and they learned like, hey, you actually like you have to stand up to this if you want it to stop. There's some like game theory that goes into it and all of that. But I'm not surprised at the big response. At first we kind of saw this muted response from China and, this relatively small list from Canada when the tariffs were first proposed in February. But now that Trump's like actually gone through with it and is doubling down, it makes sense that the retaliation is like swift and strong. We're seeing it targeted at ag, partly because that's a lot of what we export, but also because that's an important political constituency that exacting, some economic harm there will cause, congressional leaders to stand up and say, hey, what are we doing here? I think it's, the goal is to exert some political pressure. And it makes sense that, once you start going down that path, you wouldn't back down until you get the U.S. to back down. Unfortunately, that means this could, spin out of control pretty fast. We saw Trump post on Truth Social that anything Canada does, the U.S. will also match. So that could just mean we're in this like escalating tariff situation. I hope it doesn't come to that, but it very well could spin into another trade war.
Does the tax foundation have a worst case scenario for this? Like, as you look at these various things that are spinning out of control, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, the campaign proposals we saw from Trump, were like a 20% universal tariff plus 60% on China, plus retaliation from that. You very quickly stack up a really negative impact on GDP. You can even, lead to a really large disruption in the short term if all of that happens at once. It seems like in piecemeal fashion, that's kind of what Trump is trying to implement with, these IEEPA tariffs, plus we've got the impending stuff on April 2nd, the reciprocal tariffs that are going to hit probably the EU and all of our other major trading partners. So you get very close to universal tariffs, plus then we have all these product-specific tariffs. Worst case scenario would be like that all of those go into effect and that they stack on top of each other, which could result in some, potentially very high tariffs on certain categories of products. And then, retaliation on top of that. Outside of just the like tariff type trade war, I think the Trump administration is also probably likely to retaliate against other types of discriminatory taxes that other countries impose, from digital services taxes to the stuff that's going on with the global minimum tax and UTPRs in other countries. So outside of just the trade war tariffs, we could also have U.S. tariffs or other retaliatory measures in response to these tax measures, which all could stack up to something very large, very fast, and certainly outweigh any of the economic benefit of regulatory reforms or tax reforms. All of that could just be swamped.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing some of that in the Atlanta the Atlanta Fed GDP projections, where people have been stockpiling due to tariffs, consumers aren't spending due to fear over tariffs, and it seems like the economic impact is sort of self-fulfilling in that way. And you all had a statistic that I saw where these tariffs, as they are right now, will cost the average American $1,072 in the year of 2025. Can you expand on that? Like, how will it end up costing that much?
Yeah, so sometimes I think people are thrown off by the word tariff, but tariff is just a word for a tax on imported goods. So it means tax revenue paid by people and businesses in the United States to the U.S. federal government is going to go up. And that tax is, of course, assessed on the value of the goods that we're importing. We import about $1.4 trillion worth of goods from Canada, Mexico, and China combined. When you take, the tax rates times those values, you account for behavioral changes. When the cost of an import goes up, you buy a bit less of it. Maybe you substitute to other things. So we account for that. Ultimately, what it shows when we do those estimates is that if these tariffs are left in place for the full year, they will increase taxes by roughly $140 billion over the year. And if you average that out across all U.S. households, that's where that $1,000 figure comes through. We've also estimated the dynamic change in after-tax income. So that includes the tax cost plus the economic losses. And that's a bit larger on average. It's about a 1.2% decrease in after-tax income. So just think of, your income after you pay taxes and that going down 1.2%. Not a good thing that I think anyone would sign up for. That burden can be felt in different ways. So, one of the options is that an importer, pays its higher tariff to the U.S. government, and then it passes that cost along to its final consumer. So the price you pay for a retail good could go up because of tariffs. Some importers and businesses aren't going to be able to pass those costs along to consumers, so they're going to have to eat them. That eats into business revenues, which can mean, less hiring, smaller wage increases. It could mean lower returns to shareholders. So income can go down in that way as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be through a price increase. But either way, whether it's kind of like passed forward or passed backward, the effect is that it lowers the value of your income.
Yeah, that's, I think, extremely concerning, especially because most people, it seemed, voted for President Trump because he promised to fix these economic issues. And I think another thing that people will say about the tariffs is that it's sort of the art of the deal, right? Like, it's all a negotiation tactic. And so could you talk to the idea that these tariffs could reshore domestic manufacturing? And, is it a negotiation tactic at the end of the day?
So I think, you can put tariff strategy into a couple of different buckets. One is we just want to raise revenue. If you want to keep raising revenue, then imports have to keep coming into the country, so you have something to tax. You could also say we want to create this protected domestic market where domestic businesses don't face as much foreign competition. So if that's the goal, then you really want to do as much as you can to block the imports from coming in. So you want really high tariffs. Then there's the third bucket, which is negotiation strategy. You threaten a tariff, you want to get concessions out of a foreign government, and then the tariff goes away. So it's not there to raise revenue. It's also not there to create a protected domestic market. We don't really have a clear strategy as to what these, the goal, which bucket do these tariffs fall in. And sometimes it feels like it changes day to day. But even if we are in a situation where like the goal is we want more manufacturing here. Let's look at what we import. About half of what we import is intermediate goods or capital goods, so like parts and equipment that businesses use to do their production here in the United States. And then about 40% of our trade is actually intra-company trade. So it's like a parent company trading with its subsidiary or vice versa. So it's not necessarily like we're importing these final manufactured goods and so we need to shut them out so our producers can compete. Trade is really integrated. It's really complicated. We've got these global value chains where really what companies have done is innovate through trade and create these production processes that help them to produce here in the US. So if you put a tax on that, you could actually really be hurting the manufacturing sector, especially if you put a tax on inputs. What you're doing is increasing the cost of production here. So these blanket tariffs that apply to everything aren't really good strategy to boost manufacturing, to boost production here. And even if you do like a more targeted tariff, still the main effect of a protective policy like that is to reallocate resources. You may be pulling resources out of one part of the economy and putting them into the manufacturing sector, but that's not really growing things overall. That's kind of like just rearranging business investment, rearranging where workers choose to be employed. So again, it wouldn't be a broad growth strategy. It would be more redistributing economic activity and changing the pattern of how it occurs.
Yeah. So my final question is about sort of the history. President Trump likes to look to President McKinley, who was, I guess, the tariff man, even though I think at the end, McKinley didn't really like tariffs that much. So could you just talk to maybe the history of tariffs very quickly and kind of like what we've learned in the past that could inform the present moment?
Yeah, so like I just mentioned, tariffs can rearrange economic activity. And McKinley was a big fan of tariffs when he was a representative from Ohio and chaired the Ways and Means Committee, which makes sense because you can get a protective tariff. It helps your constituents. It may not help the nation overall, but that doesn't matter because the nation overall isn't voting for you. It's your constituents back home. Even so, after he shepherded the McKinley Tariff Act through Congress, which significantly increased tariffs, also made some other changes because the problem that the government had at the time was that they were raising too much revenue and they were not spending enough. So they had these huge budget surpluses. Very different situation. So one of the goals of that Congress was, okay, what can we do to spend more and actually kind of reduce how much we're raising through tariffs? They got the nickname the $1 billion Congress, and McKinley actually lost his reelection bid. So even though he was, trying to do something that would protect his constituents back home, it didn't pan out. As president, though, especially towards the end of his presidency, you saw him take a different tone. He talked about, he had a quote that commercial trade wars are not profitable and that the goal of policy needs to be to increase trade with other nations. So really big shift in his, thinking on this when he became president, especially near the end of his presidency. But besides all of that, the way that Trump talks about those tariffs is that they led to this great industrial, strength and growth. But if you actually look at what economic historians and academics have written about the period, tariffs don't have much explanatory power at all for the growth that occurred then. They may have even hindered it a little bit because they applied to capital goods, which would increase costs for manufacturers. And what really explains it is just the vast land resources that were available, huge increases in labor supply. All of those things have much more explanatory power than tariffs. So, Trump is drawing the wrong lessons from that period and the wrong lessons from the intervening years, too. I mean, we have the experience of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which most economists say worsened the Great Depression, led to a global trade war, just a drop-off in U.S. trade with other nations, and actually caused other nations to turn towards each other and trade more with each other. So the world kind of moved on without the U.S. for a little bit. We've got studies of Trump's recent tariffs, and the theme through all of these is that tariffs can certainly create concentrated benefits for the protected industry, but those benefits are coming at a cost, typically from consumers who are paying higher prices, from other businesses who have higher input costs, and from other places in the economy where those resources are being pulled from, whether it's investment or workers. So it's not, again, a story of broad growth. It's a story of, concentrated benefits and costs for everybody else.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you, Erica. This has been so helpful. And your work is amazing. The Tax Foundation, I think, is like the leading resource on all of this stuff. So thank you for everything that you've been doing.
Thank you so much.